The night air hit me like a wall of ice the second the car door slammed shut. I stood on the sidewalk in front of a gas station I had never seen before, 43 miles from home, watching the red taillights of my son's SUV disappear around a bend in the road. It was 11:17 on a Wednesday night in January. I was 68 years old. I was wearing dress slacks, a button-down shirt, and the light wool blazer I had put on 6 hours earlier for what I believed was going to be a quiet family dinner. No coat, no gloves. My cell phone was at 14% battery. The temperature outside was 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind cutting in off the open highway was driving the felt temperature down toward 8. My son Marcus had just told me to deal with it. Those were his exact words. Not an apology, not a promise to circle back and get me, not even the basic minimum of human decency, watching to confirm I had made it safely inside before he pulled away. He looked at me in the rearview mirror for exactly 1 second. 1 second of eye contact. And in that second, I saw something that I have thought about every single day since. Not anger, not guilt, not even discomfort, just impatience. The quiet, entitled impatience of a man who has been inconvenienced by someone he has already written off. Then the turn signal clicked on, that small, mechanical, utterly indifferent sound, and he merged back onto the road, and the darkness swallowed his taillights, and I was alone. I want you to hold that image. A 68-year-old man under the flickering fluorescent canopy of a highway gas station. The cold pressing through the wool of his blazer. The smell of motor oil and spilled fuel. 2 18-wheelers idling at the diesel pumps, their engines a low, indifferent rumble. A teenager behind the counter inside, face tilted toward his phone, completely unaware that anything unusual had just happened in his parking lot. This was not a stranger who had abandoned me. This was my son, the boy I taught to ride a bicycle in our driveway on a Saturday morning in 1994, with the training wheels finally off, his small hands white-knuckling the handlebars, laughing when he finally stopped wobbling. The child I had sat beside for 6 hours in a hospital waiting room when he broke his collarbone at 12. The young man I put through 4 years of university without asking him to take a single student loan. I had given Marcus, not lent, not arranged, given him outright, over $340,000 across the course of his adult life. His down payment, his car, graduate school fees, emergency transfers, when the credit card bills piled up in his late 20s, $340,000. He left me at a gas station, in 22-degree weather, and told me to deal with it. I stood on that sidewalk for 37 seconds. I counted them. I needed those seconds, because I was doing something I had learned to do, across 68 years, of a life that had asked a great deal of me. I was becoming still, not the stillness of defeat or shock. The stillness of a man who has just received an extremely clear piece of information and understands, with the calm that only comes from having already survived hard things, that the worst possible response to that information is an immediate reaction. I walked inside. I bought a cup of coffee, stale, burnt, $2.19, and I sat down in a plastic chair near the front window and called a taxi. I waited 22 minutes. I did not call Marcus. I did not call Lauren. I sat in that chair and I drank that terrible coffee, and I thought with enormous care about what I already knew, what I had long suspected, and what I was now going to spend the following weeks finding out. By the time the taxi's headlights swept across the parking lot, I had the outline of a plan. 11 weeks later, I executed it. But before I tell you what that plan looked like, before I tell you what I discovered in those 11 weeks, details that made being abandoned at a gas station look like the least of Marcus and Lauren's offenses, I want to stop and ask you something directly. Have you ever given everything, given without measuring, without tracking, without asking for credit or gratitude? Have you ever looked up from a life of that kind of giving and realized that the people you gave the most to had been quietly calculating what was still left to take. If that question landed somewhere specific in you, hit the like button right now. Subscribe to this channel, because what I am about to walk you through is not just my story. It is a blueprint. And by the time I finish, you are going to understand how a 68-year-old man left shivering under a gas station canopy became, 11 weeks later, the most powerful person in his own family. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I want to know who is in this room with me. Now, there is one more thing about that night that matters. While I sat in that plastic chair waiting for my taxi, I did something I had not done since my wife Eleanor passed away 14 months earlier. I talked to her, not out loud, but inside my head, in the way that people who have been deeply married still do long after the other person is gone. I said, "Eleanor, I think I finally see it. I think I finally see what has been happening, and I am going to handle it. Carefully. Quietly. Completely." Eleanor always saw people more clearly than I did. She had a quality I spent 34 years trying to learn from her, the ability to absorb an outrage, let it move through her, and then respond, not from the wound, but from the strategy. 3 years before she was diagnosed, she sat at our kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and said, without drama, "Something is not right with that girl, Jerry. I cannot put my finger on what it is yet, but something is not right." She meant Lauren. I told Eleanor she was being unfair. I said Lauren was just different. A different upbringing, a different way of operating. Eleanor was not being unfair. Sitting in that gas station 43 miles from home with the wind rattling the glass door, I finally admitted that to myself, fully, without softening it. And then I began to plan. What Marcus and Lauren forgot, in all of their quiet confidence, is that I did not build a $2.3 million estate by accident. I built it across 3 decades of discipline, intelligence, and a willingness to make hard decisions when they needed to be made. Every skill I used to build it, I was now fully prepared to use to protect it. They thought they were waiting for an old man to become irrelevant. They had no idea what they had just activated. My name is Gerald Hutchins. I am 68 years old. My net estate on the night Marcus left me at that gas station was approximately $2.3 million. My home, my investments, my retirement accounts, and a set of inheritance documents that had been carefully drawn up with Marcus listed as the primary beneficiary. He and Lauren knew those documents existed. They had made assumptions about what those documents contained. They had made plans around those assumptions. Every single one of those plans was about to become worthless. But to understand how I dismantled them, methodically, legally, and without a single moment of anger that they could use against me, you need to understand who I am and what I built. You need to understand the 31 years that preceded that gas station. You need to understand Eleanor and what her absence opened up, and how grief can make a man slower to see clearly than he ought to be. You need to understand all of it, because none of what I did in those 11 weeks makes sense without the foundation underneath it. And none of the satisfaction makes sense either. The very specific, very earned satisfaction of watching 2 people who had planned your diminishment discover that they had miscalculated so completely that there was nothing left to say. That satisfaction is coming. I promise you it is coming. But first, the beginning. I grew up in a house where money was something you did not discuss and rarely had enough of. My father worked the line at an auto parts plant in Dayton, Ohio, for 26 years. He was a careful man, a quiet man, the kind of man who checked the tire pressure on the family car every Sunday morning, whether it needed it or not, who kept a small notebook in his shirt pocket, where he recorded every household expense in columns so precise they looked typeset. He believed in things being in their right place. He believed in not owing anyone anything. He believed, in the particular way that men of his generation believed things, that the measure of a man was what he left behind when he was gone, not what he accumulated while he lived, but what he passed forward. He left behind a house, free and clear, and a savings account with $14,300 in it, and 3 children who never once went hungry, and a set of values about work and money that I have carried every day of my adult life. I did not inherit money from my father. I inherited his framework. I left Dayton at 18 on a partial academic scholarship to study civil engineering at Ohio State. I worked 22 hours a week in the university library to cover the gap the scholarship did not. I graduated in 1979 with a degree, $3,200 in debt, and a job offer from a municipal infrastructure firm in Columbus. I wore the same 3 dress shirts to work for the first 2 years, rotating them carefully, because I was sending $400 a month back to my parents while I paid down the loan. I did not resent the shirts. I did not resent the $400. That was simply what the situation required, and I have never in my life believed that the situation requiring something of you was a legitimate reason not to do it. I met Eleanor in 1981. She was working as a bookkeeper for a small architectural firm 3 blocks from my office. We met at a sandwich counter on a Thursday afternoon in March. She had ordered turkey on wheat, and they had given her tuna, and she was explaining to the teenager behind the counter, with enormous patience and complete clarity, exactly why this was unacceptable. I watched her do this for approximately 45 seconds, before I decided I was going to introduce myself, regardless of how the tuna situation resolved. It resolved in her favor. I introduced myself anyway. We were married in June of 1983. We had $7,400 between us, a rented apartment with a bathroom that needed regrouting, and a clarity of shared purpose that I have never been able to fully explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. We were not romantic in the way that word gets used in movies. We were something better than that. We were allies. We had a plan, and the plan was simple. We were going to build something real. Eleanor kept working after we married. She had no interest in stopping, and I had no interest in asking her to. And for the first 4 years of our marriage, we lived almost exclusively on my salary, and saved nearly everything she made. Not because we were joyless or austere. We traveled occasionally, we cooked good food, we had friends over for dinner, but we were building a foundation, and you do not build a foundation by spending the concrete. In 1984, I was recruited to a larger firm, Peterson & Associates, as a project engineer. The salary jump was $14,000 a year. We put $11,000 of it directly into savings, and did not adjust our lifestyle at all for 18 months. By 1987, we had saved enough for a down payment on a house. A real house, not a starter, not a compromise. The house we had actually planned for. A 4-bedroom colonial, on Ashford Drive, with a yard large enough for the children we intended to have, and a garage I immediately began planning to convert into a workshop. Marcus was born in 1988. He was healthy and loud, and looked exactly like Eleanor, which I told her every day for the first year of his life, until she told me, laughing, to find something else to say. I held him in the delivery room for 11 minutes, before the nurse needed him back, and in those 11 minutes, I made him every promise a father makes, and meant all of them with a completeness that I do not have better words for. I meant them. That is the part that matters. I meant every single one. By the time Marcus started school in 1993, Eleanor and I had restructured our finances around a principle we had arrived at together, through many long kitchen table conversations over the years. Everything above our monthly operating costs went into 3 buckets. 1 bucket for Marcus's education, 1 bucket for retirement. 1 bucket for the house, maintenance, improvements, eventually paying it off early. We were not wealthy, we were disciplined. There is a difference that a lot of people spend their entire lives confusing. In 1997, I was made a senior project engineer at Peterson & Associates. In 2001, following a restructuring, I was offered a partnership position. I took it, and with it came equity in the firm, and a salary of $147,000 a year. The first time in my life I had made six figures, and I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot after the meeting where it was offered, and calling Eleanor from my cell phone, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, softly, "Jerry, we did it. We actually did it. We did not change how we lived. We changed how much we saved." By 2005, Marcus's education fund had enough in it to cover 4 full years at any state university, plus a graduate degree. By 2008, despite the crash that gutted so many people's retirement accounts, we had been conservative enough in our allocations that we lost less than most and recovered faster than most, because we had planned for the crash the same way my father planned for the Sunday tire pressure check, not because we knew it was coming, but because we understood that things break, and the only honest response to that understanding is preparation. Eleanor was diagnosed with breast cancer in October of 2018. I want to be careful about how I describe what followed, because Eleanor's illness does not belong to this story the way the inheritance documents do, or the gas station does, or Lauren's particular brand of calculation does. Eleanor's illness belongs to Eleanor, and it was hers to carry, and she carried it with a grace that I am still, almost 2 years after losing her, not fully able to put into words. What I will say is this: from the October morning she received the diagnosis to the February afternoon she died, 14 months and 11 days later, I did not leave her side unless she asked me to. I worked remotely when I could, took leave when I could not work remotely, and retired fully in March of 2019, earlier than I had planned by about 3 years, because the arithmetic was simple. My wife needed me present, and I had saved enough that presence was something I could afford to give her without condition. Her medical bills across those 14 months totaled $312,000. Insurance covered $247,000 of that. The remaining $65,000 came out of our savings. She died on February 14, 2020, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, in the bedroom we had shared for 33 years, with the winter light coming through the curtains she had picked out in 1994, because she said the color reminded her of the inside of a seashell. I held her hand. I did not register until 3 days later when a neighbor stopped by with a casserole and mentioned it gently that the date was Valentine's Day. Eleanor would have found that both sentimental and absurd in equal measure. She would have made a joke about it. She would have said, in that dry, precise way she had, that she had always known I was a romantic, underneath all the sensible footwear and pension contributions. She would have laughed at her own joke. She laughed easily. I have not forgotten it. I will not forget it. After the funeral, which was attended by 212 people, because Eleanor was that kind of person, I was left alone in the house on Ashford Drive that we had bought together in 1987, with 33 years of accumulated life in its walls, and a net estate that, after Eleanor's medical costs and funeral expenses, stood at approximately $2.3 million. Let me be specific about what that consisted of, because specificity matters. The house itself, appraised at $387,000 in 2020, and was owned outright. The mortgage had been paid off in full in 2019, the year I retired, as a deliberate act of financial closure. No debt. The house was ours. Mine. My retirement investment accounts, a mix of index funds, bonds, and conservative equities built up over 30 years and actively managed through the 2008 correction and everything that followed, had a combined value of approximately $1.4 million at the time of Eleanor's death. I had a secondary brokerage account, which I had maintained separately from the retirement accounts since 1999, with a balance of approximately $440,000. This account was liquid. It was also, as I had structured it, held in a revocable living trust that I had established and maintained myself, with clear beneficiary designations that I had last reviewed and updated in 2016. Finally, there was a whole life insurance policy that Eleanor and I had taken out on me in 1991, with a current death benefit of $280,000 and a cash value, built up over nearly 30 years of premiums, of approximately $97,000. Combined, roughly $2.3 million. Marcus knew about the estate in general terms. He knew there was a house, retirement accounts, and savings. He knew I had been financially successful. What he did not know, because it was none of his business to know, and because I had never felt the need to provide a detailed accounting to my adult son, was the exact structure of those assets, which accounts held what, how the trust was organized, or what the specific beneficiary designation said. He assumed. He had been assuming for years, with a comfortable, unexamined confidence, that when I died, he would inherit the majority of what I had built. That assumption was reasonable in the abstract. He was my only child. Eleanor was gone, and the original estate planning documents did list him as primary beneficiary of most accounts. What Marcus did not know is that those documents had not been reviewed since 2016, and what he could not have known, sitting in his SUV on that Wednesday night in January, making the calculation that leaving me at a gas station was a cost-free decision, was that I had been watching him, and watching Lauren, with increasing clarity, for the better part of 2 years. Eleanor had seen it first, as she saw most things first. But I had been watching, and what I had seen had already, quietly, begun to trouble me. The gas station simply removed all remaining doubt. I did not build $2.3 million by being sentimental about arithmetic. Eleanor and I built it across 37 years of careful, deliberate, unglamorous work, and I was not going to hand it over by being sentimental about blood. That was not a decision I made in anger. It was a decision I made in the same spirit as every other decision I had made across a lifetime of building things, with a clear head and complete, unhurried intention. Marcus brought Lauren home for the first time in the spring of 2014. He had been dating her for 4 months before he mentioned her to us, which was not unusual for Marcus. He had always been private about relationships, slow to introduce anyone, careful in the way that introverted people are careful about the things they care about. He called on a Sunday evening and said, almost as an aside at the end of a conversation about something else entirely, that he was seeing someone, that her name was Lauren, that she worked in marketing for a commercial real estate firm in Chicago, and that he thought we might like to meet her sometime. I asked when. He said maybe the next time he came home. Eleanor said, warmly, we would love that. And then we hung up, and Eleanor looked at me across the kitchen table and said absolutely nothing, which with Eleanor was itself a form of commentary. Lauren arrived the following month, on a Friday evening in May, in a car Marcus was driving but that she had rented, a detail I noticed and filed away without attaching any particular meaning to at the time. She was 31 years old. She was attractive in a deliberate, high-maintenance way, the kind of attractive that announces itself, that is aware of itself, that has clearly required a significant investment of time and money to produce. She wore clothes that were expensive, without being ostentatious, which told me she understood the difference, which told me she was paying attention to things beyond what she was wearing. She shook my hand and said it was wonderful to finally meet me. She hugged Eleanor and said she had heard so much about her, which was almost certainly not true, since Marcus had told us almost nothing about her, but which was the sort of thing you say at a first meeting when you want to signal warmth and connection that you have not yet actually earned. She was charming. I want to be precise about that. She was genuinely charming, quick with a compliment, attentive in conversation, skilled at making the person she was talking to feel seen and interesting. She asked me thoughtful questions about my career. She helped Eleanor clear the dinner table without being asked. She said thank you, in the specific way that makes thank you feel like it means something. Eleanor made pot roast that Friday evening. I watched Lauren eat it, and compliment it, and ask for the recipe, and I watched Eleanor write it down on a note card, and hand it over with a warm smile, and I thought, good. This is good. That was the last time I remember feeling uncomplicated optimism about Lauren. The second visit was in September of the same year. The shift was small, So small I almost missed it. But Eleanor noticed immediately. Lauren was less curious that visit. Less interested in us, and more interested in the house. Not in the way of someone casing a property, but in the way of someone calculating. Someone whose attention, when it drifted toward the bookshelves, and the artwork, and the size of the rooms, and the view from the back deck. She asked what the neighborhood was like for resale. I said we had never thought about selling. She said, oh, of course. She was just curious. Eleanor caught my eye for exactly half a second across the dining room table, then changed the subject. That night, after Marcus and Lauren had gone upstairs, Eleanor and I sat in the kitchen the way we did when there was something to say that needed the house to be quiet first. She said, "Something is not right with that girl, Jerry." I said, "You're being a little unfair. She's just different." Eleanor said, "I know she's different. That's not what I said." I did not press her. When Eleanor said something was not right, she meant something specific. She just did not always have the specific thing identified yet, and she was patient about letting clarity arrive in its own time. I let it go. In retrospect, I should have asked more questions. Marcus proposed to Lauren in December of 2015. He called me the morning after. She had already posted photographs on 3 different social media platforms. The world had already been informed by the time Marcus got around to calling his father, and I told him I was happy for him, because I was. I wanted Marcus to have what Eleanor and I had, and I was still giving Lauren the benefit of my considerable doubt. The wedding was in July of 2016. It cost $68,000. Lauren and Marcus paid for it themselves, though I would later understand that themselves included $22,000 I had given Marcus the previous year as a family gift, money that had been earmarked in Lauren's accounting for the wedding before my check was even cashed. I did not know this at the time. I gave without conditions, without scorekeeping, the way I gave Marcus everything. I would come to understand that this approach, which I considered basic decency, was what Lauren had identified as a structural vulnerability. After the wedding, the dynamic shifted. It did not shift overnight. It shifted the way water moves through rock, slowly, through channels you do not see being carved until the day you notice the landscape has changed. Lauren began to manage the communication between Marcus and me in ways that were almost invisible. A suggestion here, a rescheduling there. The calls from Marcus became shorter, then less frequent, then replaced by texts, brief, transactional, informational. When I raised this with him directly, he seemed genuinely puzzled, as if the distance I was describing was not something he had decided. It had simply arrived. Thanksgiving of 2017 was the first holiday they did not come home for. Lauren's family was in Connecticut, and they went there instead. I told Marcus that was completely fine, and I meant it. Families require negotiation, and I was not going to be the father who made his adult son feel guilty for spending time with his wife's people. Eleanor and I had a quiet Thanksgiving, just the 2 of us. We cooked together and ate in the dining room, and it was actually a good day. But it set a pattern. In 2018, they went to Connecticut again for Thanksgiving, and for Christmas as well. I was told this in a text. Not a phone call, a text. 3 weeks before Christmas. Eleanor had already started shopping for Marcus's gifts and planned the menu. She put the shopping bag quietly back in the closet. We did not discuss it. We had Christmas quietly together, and then in October of 2018, she received her diagnosis, and Christmas became the least of our concerns. What I did not know in 2018, what I would not understand fully until after the gas station, was that Lauren had already begun a different kind of project. She had been having conversations with Marcus about my future, about what would happen when I was older, less capable, less in control of my own affairs. She framed these, I later gathered, as responsible adult planning, the kind of forward-thinking good spouses do. And Marcus, who was not a malicious person by nature, but who was also not a strong one, had listened. He had agreed. He had, in the process, come to see his father as a variable in a financial equation rather than a person whose life was still actively being lived. Lauren did not do this crudely. That is what made it so effective. She did not say, "Your father is old and his money should be ours." She said things like, "We should be thinking about how to help your dad as he gets older. We should make sure we're positioned to take care of him." These are the sentences of a responsible person. They are also the sentences of a person who has identified a target and is building the infrastructure to reach it. The difference is almost entirely a matter of what the speaker intends, and intention is the one thing a skilled person can hide with perfect ease. Lauren was both skilled and patient. The first concrete indicator, the first thing I could point to and say with certainty that this was not me misreading normal family friction, came in the spring of 2021, 14 months after Eleanor died. Lauren called me on a Wednesday afternoon, which was unusual. She never called me directly. She said she had been thinking, and she hoped I would hear her out, and that she and Marcus had been talking about the future, and they wondered if I had considered downsizing. She said the house on Ashford Drive was a lot for one person. She said they worried about me rattling around in it alone. She said there were beautiful retirement communities nearby, and she had actually done some research, and would I be open to having a conversation about it? I was 66 years old. I jogged 3 miles every other morning. I had no health conditions. I had, 14 months earlier, managed the full medical and logistical complexity of Eleanor's terminal illness and end-of-life care with precision and without assistance from Marcus or Lauren, who had visited twice in 14 months, despite living 4 hours away. I was rattling around in nothing. I was living in my house, the house Eleanor and I had bought in 1987 and paid off in full in 2019. I told Lauren, calmly and without coldness, that I appreciated her concern, but was not considering any changes to my living situation. I thanked her for thinking of me. She said, of course. She just wanted me to know the option was there. I hung up the phone and sat very still in Eleanor's chair, the reading chair, in the corner of the living room, where she had read every evening, which I had not moved, and did not intend to move, and I thought about the call. Not with anger, with recognition. Eleanor had seen it 3 years before the evidence was visible. She had said something is not right with that girl, Jerry, with the quiet certainty of a woman whose judgments were rarely wrong. And I had told her she was being unfair. I had given Lauren the benefit of a doubt that Lauren had been quietly using up. Over the following 18 months, between that phone call and the gas station, I watched with new and much more careful eyes. I watched Lauren redirect conversations about money toward Marcus whenever I raised them. I watched her manage logistics, the choreography of visits, the planning of family events, in ways that consistently positioned her as the decision-maker and Marcus as the passenger. I watched Marcus shrink in her presence, in ways he did not seem to notice, answering questions with a glance at her before speaking, editing himself mid-sentence when she shifted in her chair. I watched her reference our future plans in ways that sounded inclusive, but never actually included me as a participant, only as a resource. I said nothing, because I had learned, across 68 years, that the most dangerous thing you can do when you suspect someone is undermining you is to tip them off that you have noticed. And then came the Wednesday in January, when Marcus looked at me in the rearview mirror for 1 second and pulled back onto the road. I had seen enough. I did not need more evidence. I needed a plan. And in the taxi home, 43 miles in the dark, 22 degrees outside, the meter clicking steadily, I began to build one. The Wednesday it happened started the way most Wednesdays started. I woke at 6:15, made coffee in the kitchen while the January dark held outside the window, and sat at the table with the newspaper the way Eleanor and I had done every morning for 30 years. The chair across from me was empty. It had been empty for 14 months, and I had not stopped setting a cup on that side of the table anyway, not out of delusion, but because the ritual felt like a form of respect I was not ready to abandon. I drank my coffee. I read the paper. At 7:30, I jogged 3 miles in the cold, my breath coming in white clouds above the empty street. By 9 o'clock, I was back at my desk, working through correspondence with my financial advisor about reallocating a portion of the bond holdings in my retirement account. Routine maintenance of the kind that a disciplined investor does regularly. I had a cup of tea. I answered 2 emails. The morning was quiet and completely unremarkable. Marcus called at 11:43. He wanted to know if I would come to dinner that Wednesday evening. He and Lauren had a friend in town, Lauren's college roommate, a woman named Diane who was passing through on a business trip, and they were going to take her out to a restaurant downtown. Would I like to join them? It was presented as an invitation. It had the tone of an invitation. But I noticed, as I had been noticing things for the past 18 months, that it was also issued with only 6 hours' notice, on a weekday, to a 68-year-old man who lived 43 miles away, and that the framing of it, a dinner for Lauren's friend, to which I was being appended, was not quite the same as being invited to a family dinner. But I said yes, because he was my son, and I wanted to see him, and because I was still, despite everything I had watched and thought over the past 2 years, operating from a position of good faith. I drove the 43 miles in light traffic. I arrived at 6:50, 10 minutes early, because I was raised to be punctual. The restaurant was one Lauren had chosen, a modern American place downtown, the kind with small plates and a cocktail program and lighting designed to make everyone look better than they feel. I found a parking spot 2 blocks away and walked in out of the cold. They were already seated. Marcus stood when I came in, which I appreciated. Lauren smiled and introduced me to Diane, who was pleasant and well-dressed and seemed genuinely happy to meet me. We ordered drinks. We ordered food, small plates, as the menu demanded, circling around the table in a way that required coordination and produced, in my experience, the particular low-grade anxiety of never being quite sure if you have eaten enough. I had a bourbon, then water. I do not drink heavily, and I did not that evening. The dinner itself was fine. Diane was good company. She worked in healthcare administration. She had stories. She asked reasonable questions and listened to the answers. We talked about the city, about her work, about a bridge I had worked on 20 years ago that she passed every day on her commute and had never known the name of the engineer who designed it. I told her the name. She seemed to find this genuinely interesting. Marcus was warm that evening, more present than he had been in some of our recent interactions, laughing easily, refilling my water glass before I asked, and I found myself thinking, again, with that persistent good faith that I now recognize as the last stubborn residue of fatherly hope, that perhaps the evening was simply what it appeared to be, a dinner, a connection, a normal Wednesday with his father. This is what I want you to understand about how well-designed the evening was. It was designed to feel normal. Right up until the moment it stopped being normal, it felt like nothing more than a slightly awkward family dinner at a restaurant with lighting that was trying too hard. Lauren was gracious and smooth, and said almost nothing directed at me for the first hour and a half. At 8:15, Diane mentioned she needed to get back to her hotel. She had an early meeting the next morning, a presentation. She was already anxious about the time. Marcus immediately signaled for the check, which Lauren had clearly expected, because she already had her card in her hand. I reached for my wallet. Lauren said, "Oh, Gerald, please, we've got it." I put my wallet away. The check came. Lauren paid it. We walked out together onto the street. The temperature had dropped further since I arrived. It was colder now than it had been when I parked, the kind of deep January cold that announces itself through your coat the moment you step outside. Diane's hotel was 4 blocks east. Marcus's car was in a parking garage half a block north. My car was 2 blocks south. I said, "I'll walk with you to the garage, Marcus, and then head to my car from there." Lauren said, "Actually, we're going to drop Diane at her hotel first." I said, "Of course, that makes sense. I'll just head to my car then. It was good to meet you, Diane." Lauren said, "Gerald, why don't you ride with us? We'll drop Diane, and then drop you at your car on the way back." The way back. I processed that phrase. My car was 2 blocks south. Diane's hotel was 4 blocks east. A drop-off at the hotel and a return to the parking garage would pass nowhere near my car. It would take them in the opposite direction entirely. The offer did not make logistical sense. But it was cold, and I was 68, and I did not want to read calculation into what might simply be a thoughtless kindness, so I said thank you, and got in the back seat of Marcus's SUV. Diane was in the front passenger seat. Marcus drove. Lauren sat beside me in the back. We drove to Diane's hotel. We pulled up to the entrance. Diane hugged Lauren, shook Marcus's hand, thanked everyone warmly, and went inside. The hotel doors slid shut behind her. Marcus put the car in gear and drove east. I said, mildly, "My car is back west, Marcus." Lauren said, from beside me, "We know. We thought we'd drive a bit first. Diane's friend has a place not far from here, and she wanted to drop something off for her, so we're just making a quick stop." I said, "I wasn't aware of that." Lauren said, "It won't take long." We drove for 11 minutes. I watched the GPS on the dashboard the way I had watched it my entire career, with the attention of someone who understands that coordinates do not lie even when people do. We were moving east, then northeast. The restaurant was behind us. My car was behind us. The landmarks I knew fell away one by one, and were replaced by the kind of featureless commercial corridor that exists on the outskirts of every mid-size American city. Gas stations and chain restaurants, and car dealerships dark for the night, parking lots lit by tall sodium lamps that turned everything the color of old paper. Lauren was on her phone beside me. She had been on her phone since we left the hotel. She did not look up. I said nothing. I watched the GPS. Marcus pulled into a gas station. He stopped the car. He put it in park. There was a silence that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds I understood, with the particular clarity that comes when a suspicion you have been carrying for months is suddenly confirmed not by evidence, but by the thing itself actually happening, that there was no friend. There was no quick stop. There was no item being dropped off. I said, "What are we doing here?" Marcus said, "Dad, this is the closest stop on the way. You can get an Uber from here." I looked at him, then at Lauren. Lauren was looking at her phone. I said, "This is 43 miles from my house." Marcus said, "I know, Dad, but we've got an early morning tomorrow, and the drive back would add over an hour to our night. You can get an Uber." I said, Marcus, my car is 2 blocks from the restaurant." Marcus said, "Dad." Lauren said, without looking up from her phone, "Gerald, there's a gas station right here. You'll be fine." I said, "It's 22 degrees outside." Lauren said nothing. Marcus looked at the steering wheel. I said, "Marcus, look at me." He looked at me, in the rearview mirror. 1 second. He said, "Dad, just deal with it. There's a gas station right here." And he waited. I opened the door. The cold air entered the car. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, and I closed the door behind me, and I stood there, and I watched Marcus's turn signal blink 3 times, and then the SUV moved back into the road. I counted 37 seconds. I want to describe what those 37 seconds felt like, because people ask me, when I tell this story, people always ask me whether I was angry, whether I wanted to shout, to call him back, to stand in the road and force a confrontation. The answer is that I did not feel angry in the way people mean when they ask that question. What I felt was colder than anger. Anger is a hot thing. It rises fast, clouds your thinking, makes you loud and visible and predictable. Angry people are easy to manage. You give them something to push against, and they exhaust themselves pushing. I had watched Lauren handle Marcus's frustrations exactly that way for years. An angry Gerald Hutchins, calling Marcus back, making a scene in a gas station parking lot, was a Gerald Hutchins she already knew how to handle. What I felt standing on that sidewalk was the opposite of hot. It was the specific, windless cold of someone who has just received the last piece of information they needed. Someone who now knows, with complete and unhurried certainty, exactly what they are going to do. I was not going to call Marcus. I was not going to argue with Lauren. I was not going to make any move they would see coming. What I was going to do was much quieter than that, and much more permanent. They had planned it. Not necessarily that specific night or that specific gas station, but the principle had been discussed. I was certain of that. The decision to strand me had not been made in the car on the way to Diane's hotel. It had been made at a kitchen table in Marcus and Lauren's house, in the language of practicality and future planning that Lauren had been constructing for years. This evening was not thoughtlessness, it was policy. Lauren had not looked up from her phone. That detail, that was the one I came back to, again and again, standing on that sidewalk, and later waiting for the taxi, and later still in the dark back seat of the cab, as it carried me 43 miles home through the January night. She had not looked up from her phone, because looking up would have meant acknowledging what was happening, would have meant either endorsing it with direct eye contact or registering something recognizable as guilt. She chose neither. She looked at her phone. I was not worth the effort of either response. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not the being stranded, the not looking up, because that is the tell. A person who felt any residual care for you would look up, would at minimum make eye contact, would offer the small human dignity of being seen in the moment you are being discarded. Lauren had decided I did not merit that, and the fact that she made that decision so comfortably, without any visible internal conflict, that told me the decision had not been made that night. It had been made a long time ago. The gas station was simply the first occasion to act on it. That was the moment I stopped being Gerald Hutchins, father, grieving widower, man extending good faith to people he loved, despite accumulating evidence that the good faith was not being returned. I became something else in those 37 seconds. I became, very quietly, and with complete intention, the man who was going to fix this. I walked into the gas station. The teenager behind the counter looked up briefly from his phone and looked back down. I bought a cup of coffee, $2.19, burnt and stale, sitting in a pot that had been on the burner for God knows how long. I took it to the plastic chair near the front window. I sat down. I called a taxi. While I waited, 22 minutes, which I know because I timed it, I did not call Marcus. I did not call Lauren. I did not call my neighbor, or my financial advisor, or any of the 3 friends who would have come to get me without a second's hesitation if I had asked. I did not want anyone to come and get me. I did not want company, or consolation, or the warm, well-meaning flood of someone else's outrage on my behalf. I wanted silence. I wanted to think. So I sat. I drank the terrible coffee. I thought. I thought about the estate documents last reviewed in 2016. I thought about the revocable living trust. Revocable, that word, which has a specific legal meaning that Marcus and Lauren had apparently never looked up. I thought about my financial advisor, David Chen, 19 years with me, completely trusted. I thought about the estate attorney, Margaret Hollis, who had been sending me gentle annual reminders to review our planning documents since Eleanor's death. Reminders I had deferred, first from grief and then from inertia, and which I now understood I had been given exactly enough time to act on. I thought about the fact that a revocable living trust can be amended, that beneficiary designations can be changed, that a will is not a monument, it is a document, and documents can be rewritten by the person who created them, at any point, for any reason, without notice to anyone. The taxi's headlights swept across the parking lot. The driver honked twice. I finished the coffee. I stood up. I walked outside into the cold. 11 weeks. That was what it took. By the time Marcus and Lauren understood what had happened, it was already, completely and permanently done. The taxi dropped me at my front door at 12:41 in the morning. I paid the driver, $47.30, and stood on my front porch for a moment. The street was quiet. The January cold was absolute. The house was dark except for the porch light I always left on, a habit from the years when Marcus was a teenager and Eleanor and I waited up without admitting to each other that we were waiting. I unlocked the door. I drank a full glass of water at the kitchen counter. Then I went to bed. I did not sit cataloging grievances. I did not lie awake rehearsing the argument or composing what I wished I had said. I went to bed. I slept 7 hours. I woke at 6:15 and made coffee, and I was ready. Marcus called at 9:27 that morning. I let it ring. He called again at 10:40. I let that one ring too. He sent a text at 11:15 that said, "Dad, just wanted to make sure you got home okay last night. Let me know." I read the text. I did not respond. Not out of spite. I want to be clear about that distinction, because it matters. Spite is emotional. What I was doing was strategic. I was not ready to speak to Marcus yet, because I had not decided what I wanted him to know, and until I had made that decision, silence was the correct position. Lauren did not call or text at all. I noted that. I spent the morning at my desk with a legal pad and a cup of coffee, doing what I had done at every significant decision point in my professional life. I made a list. Not of grievances. I was not interested in grievances as a category. I made a list of assets, of documents, of professionals I needed to contact, and of questions I needed answered before I could make any irreversible moves. Because the most important thing I had learned across 31 years of engineering, of designing structures that had to bear real loads in real conditions for decades, was this: you do not build the solution before you fully understand the problem. You assess, you document, you verify, then you build. The list had 4 columns. The first column was what I owned: the house at $387,000, owned outright; the retirement accounts at approximately $1.4 million; the brokerage account inside the revocable living trust at approximately $440,000, and the whole life insurance policy with a death benefit of $280,000. Combined estate, $2.3 million. The second column was how those assets were currently structured. Specifically, who was named as beneficiary on each. This was the column Marcus and Lauren had been quietly assuming contained their names. They were right that it contained Marcus's name. They were wrong to assume that was permanent. A revocable trust is revocable because the person who created it retains the right to change it. That is not a loophole. That is the entire point of the instrument. The third column was professionals. David Chen, my financial advisor of 19 years. Margaret Hollis, my estate attorney, whose 5 reminder emails about reviewing the planning documents I had been deferring since Eleanor's death, and who I was calling first thing in the morning, and a second attorney I would consult independently to ensure I had an unbiased picture of my options. The fourth column was what I needed to verify before moving. Any joint accounts, co-signed instruments, or financial entanglements with Marcus I might have overlooked. I did not believe any existed, but I was not going to operate from belief. I was going to operate from documentation. I finished the list. I read it twice. Then I folded it in half and put it in the locked drawer of my desk, where I kept my passport and the original deed to the house. Then I picked up the phone and I called Marcus back. He answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting. I could hear something careful in his voice. Not guilt exactly, but the particular alertness of a person who has done something they know was wrong and is gauging whether the other person knows it too. I said, "Marcus, I got your messages. I'm fine. I got home safely. He said, Dad, I'm sorry about last night. It was a long evening and it was a lot. I said, I understand. These things happen. There was a pause. He was waiting for more, waiting for the confrontation, the wounded father speech, the demand for an explanation. I gave him none of those things. I said I was tired, and I would talk to him soon, and I said it warmly, without edge, the way you say something you mean. And I hung up. I heard him exhale before the call ended. Relief. He thought it had passed. He thought 68-year-old Gerald Hutchins had accepted the explanation. It was a long evening, these things happen, and moved on. I noted that too. The following morning I called Margaret Hollis. Margaret had been our estate attorney since 1998. She was 71 years old, sharp as a new blade, and she had attended Eleanor's funeral. She had sent me a handwritten condolence note on good stationery, which I had kept. She had also, in the 14 months since Eleanor's death, sent me 5 gentle emails suggesting I come in to review our estate planning documents, noting that the death of a spouse typically warranted a comprehensive review of all beneficiary designations, trust instruments, and testamentary documents. I had deferred all 5. I was not deferring anymore. Her assistant put me through within 3 minutes. Margaret said, Gerald, I've been hoping you'd call. How are you holding up? I said, I'm well, Margaret. I'd like to come in as soon as possible. I need to review everything. She heard something in my voice, or perhaps she simply understood, from the 5 unreturned scheduling emails, that my calling now meant something specific had changed. She said, I can fit you in Thursday at 2 o'clock. I said, I'll be there. I spent the 2 days before the Thursday appointment doing exactly what I had outlined in the 3rd column of my list, pulling documents. Every account statement, every insurance instrument, the original trust document, which I had not read in full since 2016, the will, the healthcare proxy and power of attorney, both of which listed Marcus as my designated agent, a fact that I now examined with entirely new eyes. A healthcare proxy designates another person to make medical decisions on your behalf if you are incapacitated. A power of attorney gives another person authority to act on your behalf in legal and financial matters. Both of my documents, executed in 2014, named Marcus as my primary agent. In 2014, that was a reasonable and loving decision. In the January of the year I am describing, Marcus was the man who had driven me 43 miles from my car on a Wednesday night and told me to deal with it. I revoked both documents before my Thursday appointment. I knew how. I had the forms, completed them, signed them, had them notarized at the bank Friday morning, and brought the revocations to Margaret, along with everything else I had pulled. Margaret's office smelled of good paper and old wood. She sat across the desk in a dark blazer, reading glasses on, the original trust document open in front of her, and she listened to me for 22 minutes without interrupting. I told her everything, not to process or vent, but to be briefed on my options, and to begin giving instructions. When I finished, she looked at me over her glasses for a moment. She said, Gerald, I want to make sure I understand what you're asking me to do. I said, I want the trust amended. I want the will revised. I want every beneficiary designation that currently names Marcus as primary beneficiary changed, and I want to understand, precisely, what Marcus and Lauren would currently be entitled to if I died tonight, so I know exactly what I am working from. Margaret said, if you died tonight, Marcus would receive the full proceeds of the retirement accounts, the trust assets, and be named executor of the will. He would also hold your healthcare proxy and power of attorney. I said, the proxy and POA are already revoked as of this morning. She nodded. She made a note. She said, who do you want to name in their place? I said, I have a list. I slid the second piece of paper across her desk. On it were 4 names. My sister Patricia, who was 64 years old and lived 20 minutes away, and had driven me to Eleanor's oncology appointments when Marcus could not be bothered. My friend Robert Garfield, who had been my closest friend for 37 years, and who I trusted, as I trusted my own judgment. Margaret herself, named as successor trustee, and a charitable organization, the Eleanor Hutchins Memorial Foundation, which did not yet exist but which I intended to establish, and which would receive the bulk of the estate in the event the trust was not otherwise directed. Margaret looked at the list. She looked at me. She said, "This is a significant restructuring, Gerald." I said, "I know. That's why I'm here." She said, "I want you to take a week. Not because I doubt your decision. I don't. But because decisions of this magnitude are better made with a week of distance. And I want to be able to say, if anyone ever asks, that you were thoughtful and deliberate and not acting in the immediate aftermath of an upsetting event." I said, "The event was 3 days ago, Margaret. I have had 3 days. I have slept on it. I have made my list. I am not acting from emotion." She studied me for a moment. Then she nodded. She said, "All right, let's get started." We worked for 2 hours. At the end, I understood exactly what I owned, exactly how it was currently distributed, and exactly what needed to change. Margaret would draft the amended trust, the revised will, and the new proxy and power of attorney documents naming Patricia and Robert. She estimated 2 weeks to have everything ready for signature. 2 weeks. I wrote the date in my notebook and drove home through the winter afternoon with the particular feeling that accompanies the beginning of a large and necessary project. Not relief, not triumph, just the clean, purposeful weight of having begun. Marcus had not called again since that brief call the morning after the gas station. He would call eventually. They always do, when the silence goes on long enough to become uncomfortable. And when he did, I was going to be ready. But first I needed to understand exactly how deep the plan against me went. Because Margaret had asked me a question near the end of our meeting that I had not been able to fully answer. A question that sent me, in the weeks that followed, down a path that revealed something far worse than a stranding in a gas station parking lot. Something that changed the nature of what I was dealing with entirely. She had asked, "Gerald, have you noticed any unusual activity in your financial accounts in the past year or two?" I said, "What kind of unusual activity?" She said, "Transfers, withdrawals, changes to account access or beneficiary designations that you didn't initiate." I said, "I don't believe so, but I haven't looked closely." She said, "Look closely." I looked closely. I looked closely for 3 days. I pulled every statement from every account going back 24 months, printed them all, and spread them across the dining room table in the order Margaret had suggested. Retirement accounts first, then the brokerage trust account, then the insurance policy, then the daily checking and savings. I sat down with a cup of coffee, and I began to read with the same methodical attention I had given to structural load calculations for 31 years, looking not for what was obviously wrong, but for what was subtly inconsistent, for the number that didn't belong, for the pattern that broke. It took me until the 3rd day to find it. It was not in the retirement accounts. Those were clean, managed by David Chen, with whom I had a relationship of complete mutual transparency, and whose quarterly reports I had been reading carefully for nearly 2 decades. It was not in the daily checking account. It was in the brokerage account inside the revocable living trust, the liquid account, the one holding approximately $440,000, the one whose structure I had not examined in close detail since 2016, because I had trusted, as one trusts well-built infrastructure, that what had been correctly set up would remain correctly configured. I found it on a Tuesday afternoon, in the 3rd week of January, sitting at the dining room table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, the winter light slanting through the windows at the low angle it takes when the sun cannot quite clear the roofline across the street. The account had a second authorized user. Not a beneficiary. Not a named successor. An authorized user. Someone granted viewing access to the account who, 14 months earlier, had made a single inquiry to the brokerage's customer service line asking about the process for initiating a transfer of trust assets. The inquiry had not resulted in a transfer. The representative had correctly informed the caller that a non-trustee authorized user had no transfer authority. The call had been logged in the account's service history, which I had never examined because I had never had reason to. The authorized user was Lauren. I sat very still for a long time. I had been the sole trustee of the Revocable Living Trust since I created it in 1999. Eleanor had been named co-trustee, and after her death I became sole trustee by operation of the trust instrument itself. Adding an authorized user to a brokerage account does not require trustee status. It is a separate, lower-level permission that allows someone to view account information. It does not grant them the ability to move money, but it does grant them the ability to know exactly how much money is there. And it tells you, unambiguously, that someone has been watching. The authorization had been added in March of 2020, 5 weeks after Eleanor's funeral. I need you to hold that timeline. Eleanor died on February 14, 2020. Marcus and Lauren attended the funeral, stayed 3 days, and went home. 5 weeks after she was in the ground. 5 weeks after I was at my most alone, most grieving, most disoriented, someone had called the brokerage and arranged for Lauren to have viewing access to the account, holding nearly $500,000 of my liquid assets. I called the brokerage directly, identified myself as account holder and sole trustee, and asked them to pull the service history going back 3 years. 4 calls total, 2 routine, a statement request in 2019, a dividend question in 2021. The third was the March 2020 call that added Lauren as authorized user. The fourth, 14 months later, January 2021, 1 month before she called me about downsizing, was Lauren inquiring about the process for transferring trust assets. I asked the representative, who made the March 2020 call that added the authorized user? The representative said, I can see that it was initiated by the account holder. I said, I made that call? She said, the call was authenticated using the account's security information. PIN, last 4 of social, date of birth. Yes. I said, I see. Thank you. I hung up. I sat in the chair for 11 minutes without moving. 11 minutes, which I know because I looked at the clock when I picked up the phone, and I looked at it again when I finally stood up. The call had been authenticated using my security information, my PIN, my social security number, my date of birth, all of which Marcus knew. In the days after Eleanor's death, when Marcus was in the house helping manage her affairs, the funeral home calls, the notifications, the paperwork that death generates in appalling quantities, he had access to every document, every file, every locked drawer whose combination he had known since he was a teenager. He had used my security credentials to call the brokerage. He had added Lauren as an authorized user, and then they had waited and watched, and 14 months later, Lauren had called to ask about the transfer process, and had discovered that viewing access was not the same as transfer authority, and that she could see the money but could not move it without being named trustee. Which was why she had called me about downsizing in the spring of 2021, because Plan A, gaining quiet transfer authority over the liquid account, had not worked. And Plan B was getting me out of the house I owned, into a facility someone else managed, in a situation where my capacity to oversee my own affairs might be more easily questioned. I understood now what I was dealing with. This was not a bad night. This was not a difficult daughter-in-law and a conflict over family dynamics. This was a coordinated, multi-year effort to access my estate, first through financial surveillance, then through an attempted transfer inquiry, then through the downsizing pressure campaign, and finally, when none of those had worked, through whatever came next. The gas station was not the cruelest thing they had done to me. It was not even close. The cruelest thing was the March 2020 call. The cruelest thing was that while I was sitting in my house 5 weeks after burying my wife of 37 years, disoriented with grief, unable to sleep through a full night, eating meals that neighbors kept dropping off because I could not remember to cook, while I was in that state, my son and his wife were making calls to my financial accounts using my stolen credentials. I did not shout. I did not break anything. I sat surrounded by 2 years of account statements, and I thought about Eleanor's reading chair in the corner of the living room, and what she would say if she were sitting in it right now, watching me. She would say, "Jerry, now you know. Now finish it." I called Margaret Hollis. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I had found. I described the March 2020 call, the authorized user edition, the January 2021 transfer inquiry. I was precise. I gave her dates, amounts, call log entries. I did not editorialize. I stated facts. Margaret was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then she said, carefully, "Gerald, what you're describing is potentially more than an estate planning matter." I said, "I know." She said, "The use of your security credentials without your authorization to access your accounts, depending on the specifics, that could constitute unauthorized access to financial accounts. That's a legal matter that goes beyond my practice area. I can refer you to someone." I said, "Please do." She gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in financial elder law and elder financial abuse. His name was James Whitfield. She said he was thorough, he was discreet, and he would know exactly what I was looking at. I said, "Margaret, does any of this affect the timeline for the estate documents?" She said, "No. We proceed exactly as planned. Faster, if anything." I said, "Faster." She said, "Faster." I called James Whitfield the following morning and was seen the next day. I brought my printed statements, the brokerage call log, and a timeline written in my engineering notebook, dates, events, amounts, and sat in his office for 90 minutes while he asked questions with the methodical precision of a man who had seen this category of problem before and knew exactly where to look. At the end of the 90 minutes, he leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He said, "Mr. Hutchins, what you have described is consistent with elder financial exploitation, the access gained during bereavement, the subsequent inquiry into transfer mechanisms, the ongoing campaign to reduce your independent living situation. These are recognizable elements." I said, "What are my options?" He said, "First, we document everything, every call log, every statement, every communication. Second, I would recommend contacting your brokerage directly to revoke the authorized user status and place a security flag on the account, requiring additional verification for any access requests. Third, and this is your decision, not mine, you have the option of filing a report with Adult Protective Services, which handles elder financial abuse cases, and potentially with law enforcement." I said, "I want to understand the full picture before I decide about reporting. What else should I be looking for?" He said, "Look at every account, every one. Look for any changes to access, any inquiries you didn't make, any contact information that's been altered, and look at your mail, physical mail. Has anything been redirected?" I said, "I don't know. I hadn't thought of that." He said, "Check." I drove home and I checked. The mail forwarding was the thing that finally broke through whatever remained of my capacity to be surprised. A forwarding order had been placed with the Postal Service 14 months ago, the same month as the authorized user edition, March of 2020, routing copies of my brokerage statements to a second address. The second address was a P.O. box in the city where Marcus and Lauren lived. They had been receiving copies of my financial statements for 14 months. They knew, to the dollar, what was in every account. They had known since 5 weeks after Eleanor's funeral. I stood at my mailbox in the January cold, holding the forwarding record, and I did not feel anger, and I did not feel grief. What I felt was a very final, very complete clarity. The kind that comes when you find the one load-bearing element you had missed, and suddenly the whole structure resolves into perfect, terrible sense. I went inside. I sat at my desk. I called David Chen. I said, "David, I need you to conduct a complete audit of every account I hold, going back 3 years. And then I need to schedule a meeting, because I have some significant changes to make." He said, "Gerald, is everything all right?" I said, "Everything is fine. It is about to be considerably better." I put the phone down. Marcus called that evening. He said he and Lauren were thinking of coming to visit the following weekend, and did I want them to come? His voice was easy, relaxed, the voice of a man who believed the gas station was already in the past, and that the future was moving in the direction he had planned. I said, "That would be lovely, Marcus. I'll look forward to it." I hung up, and I opened my engineering notebook to a fresh page, and I wrote at the top, in the precise block letters I had used on every project document for 31 years, Phase 2. Underneath it, I began to write. Phase 2 began on a Thursday morning, with a phone call to David Chen. David had been my financial advisor for 19 years, methodical, conservatively dressed, the kind of man who returned calls within the hour and never made a recommendation he couldn't defend in writing. He had managed Eleanor's accounts as well as mine. When I called him that Thursday, he listened to everything without interrupting, the way people who are very good at their jobs listen, not waiting to speak, but actually absorbing. When I finished, he was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "Gerald, I want to be careful about how I respond to this, because some of what you're describing is outside my professional scope. But what I can tell you is this. The audit you're asking for is something I can begin immediately. And when it's done, I want you to bring everything, the Whitfield meeting notes, the brokerage call log, the mail forwarding documentation, and we are going to sit down together and go through it all." I said, "How long for the audit?" He said, "Give me a week. I want to be thorough." I said, "Thorough is exactly right." I put down the phone and looked at the engineering notebook open on my desk. Phase 2 was written at the top of the page in block letters. Beneath it, I had written 4 lines the night before, while Marcus's call was still fresh in my ear. That easy, relaxed voice, the voice of a man who thought he knew how this story ended. The 4 lines were: 1. Complete the estate restructuring with Margaret. Sign the amended trust, the revised will, the new proxy and POA documents. 2. Complete the financial audit with David. Identify every point of unauthorized access. Document it completely. Preserve the evidence. 3. Revoke the authorized user status on the brokerage account. Place the security flag. Change every account PIN, every password, every piece of security information Marcus might have known. 4. Decide, with full information and without rushing, what to do about Marcus and Lauren. I was on step 2. I needed to move carefully. The worst thing I could do was move too fast and alert them that the landscape had changed. Marcus had called expecting a normal weekend visit. I had 10 days before they arrived, 10 days during which they would expect silence, normalcy, the aging father in his house, no cause for alarm. I intended to give them exactly that. The first hunt cycle began that same Thursday. I drove to my primary bank, an account held since 1985, and sat with the branch manager, Sandra, who had handled my accounts for 11 years. I told her I had become aware of unauthorized use of my security information and needed to change all of it. Every PIN, every password, every security question. I also asked her to add a verbal password requirement. Any phone request to access or modify the account would require a verbal code only I knew, in addition to standard authentication. Sandra asked, "Do you want to file a report?" I said, "Not yet. I want to complete my documentation first." She said she understood, and told me that when I was ready, they had procedures and I would not be doing it alone, I thanked her and drove to my next stop, the brokerage where the trust account was held. I walked in, asked for the senior account manager, and sat down in a glass-walled office with a man named Paul who wore a tie and took careful notes. I told him I needed to revoke authorized user access for a specific individual on my trust account. He pulled up the account. He confirmed Lauren's name. He removed it in 4 minutes. I watched him do it. I also asked him to add a notation to the account file. Any future requests to add authorized users, change contact information, or inquire about transfer procedures must be made in person by the account holder with government-issued photo identification, no phone authentication, in person only. He said, "That's an unusual restriction." I said, "I have unusual reasons." He made the notation. I drove home. I made lunch. I sat at my desk, and I updated the engineering notebook. Bank security updated. Authorized user revoked. Transfer inquiry restrictions in place. 3 items completed before noon. I drew a line through each one. There is a specific satisfaction in drawing a line through completed work. Not pride, but the clean, functional pleasure of movement in the right direction. That afternoon, I called Patricia. My sister Patricia was 64 years old, retired, and sharp as ever. She was the person who had driven me to Eleanor's oncology appointments on the Tuesday mornings when I had a conflict, had simply appeared at my door on those Tuesdays with a travel mug of coffee and a bag of the shortbread cookies Eleanor liked, sat in the waiting room for 3 hours, then driven us home and refused dinner because she said she had somewhere to be, which was almost certainly not true. I told Patricia everything. She listened the way Eleanor used to listen, completely, without interruption, with that quality of absolute attention that makes the person speaking feel that what they are saying is the only thing that matters. When I finished, there was a brief silence, and then she said, with the particular directness that had characterized her since childhood, "Jerry, what do you need from me?" I said, "I need you to be willing to serve as my healthcare proxy and primary agent under a power of attorney. Margaret will have the documents ready within the next 2 weeks," she said. "Of course, without question." I said, "I also need you to know what's happening, in its entirety, so that if anything changes in my situation, if for any reason I become unable to manage my own affairs, you have the full picture." She said, "I understand." I said, "And Patricia, I need you to not contact Marcus or Lauren about any of this. Not yet." She was quiet for a moment. I knew what she was thinking. Patricia was not the kind of person who found silence easy when she believed an injustice was being committed. But she understood strategy when she needed to. She said, "All right, when you're ready to move, I'll be there." The second hunt cycle completed itself 3 days later, on a Sunday evening, when David Chen called. He had finished a preliminary pass of the audit, not the full audit, which would take the full week, but enough to give me a first picture. He had found 2 things I had not known about. The first was a beneficiary designation discrepancy on my whole life insurance policy. The policy had been established in 1991 with Eleanor as primary beneficiary and Marcus as contingent. When Eleanor died, the primary beneficiary position automatically transferred by operation of the policy terms to the contingent beneficiary, Marcus. This was correct and expected. What was not expected was that the insurance company's records showed a change request had been submitted in April of 2020, 2 months after Eleanor's death, requesting that a secondary beneficiary be added to the contingent position. The name on the change request was Lauren Hutchins. The request had been submitted by mail on a form the insurance company had on file, signed purportedly by me, during the period when all my mail was being forwarded to the P.O. box. The insurance company had processed the change. Lauren was now listed as a secondary contingent beneficiary on my whole life policy, positioned to receive 50% of the $280,000 death benefit if I died and Marcus predeceased me. I wrote this down in the notebook. slowly. Dates, amounts, company name, the date of the request, the date it was processed. Then I read it back once, to make sure I had it exactly right. The second thing David had found was a phone inquiry to my retirement account custodian. Not a change, just an inquiry. Made in November of 2021, 11 months before the gas station, in which an unknown caller had asked about the process for establishing a limited power of attorney over a retirement account on behalf of an elderly account holder who was showing signs of cognitive decline. The account custodian had noted the call and flagged it as unusual. They had not acted on it, but they had logged it. Cognitive decline. Someone had called my retirement account custodian and described me as showing signs of cognitive decline. I, who at that point was jogging 3 miles every other morning, managing my own financial accounts with complete precision, and corresponding regularly with a financial advisor who had seen no indication of anything of the kind. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about what it meant as a strategy, because that was what it was. If you are building a case that a person cannot manage their own affairs, you do not begin with a formal legal proceeding. You begin by planting the idea. You make a phone call. You use language, showing signs of cognitive decline, that creates an informal record that someone was concerned about their mental capacity. You build a paper trail before anyone is looking for one. And when the time comes to challenge the estate, you point to that record. We were worried about this months ago. This didn't come out of nowhere. They had been building a case to have me declared incompetent. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually, methodically, in exactly the way Lauren did everything, quietly, in advance, with the infrastructure laid before anyone thought to look. I closed the notebook. I looked out the window at the January dark. The weekend visit was in 6 days. I picked up the phone and called Robert Garfield. Robert was my oldest friend. We had met in 1987 when he was the structural engineer on the first large project I managed at Peterson & Associates, and we had been close ever since, in the way two people become close when they have worked through something genuinely difficult together and discovered each can trust the other under pressure. He was 69, recently retired, and the person I would have called the night of the gas station if I had wanted to call anyone. But I had needed to think before I talked. Now I was ready. I told Robert everything. Every call log, every account entry, the insurance change, the retirement account inquiry, the mail forwarding, the authorized user addition. Chronologically, without emotion, each fact building on the last. When I finished, Robert was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Jerry, how are you holding up?" I said, "I'm fine, Robert. Better than I've been in 2 years, honestly. I know what I'm dealing with now. That's better than not knowing." He said, "What do you need?" I said, "The same thing I asked Patricia, to serve under the new power of attorney, and to be my witness, if it comes to that." He said, "Absolutely, whatever you need." I said, "They're coming in 6 days." Robert said, "Are you going to tell them what you know?" I said, "No." He said, "Good." I said, "I'm going to finish everything first. Sign the documents, complete the audit, file the reports. And then I'm going to let them tell me, one more time, exactly who they think they're dealing with." Robert laughed. It was a short sound, not unkind. The laugh of someone who has known you for 37 years and knows exactly what you mean. He said, "Give them enough rope." I said, "As much as they need." The weekend visit was scheduled for Saturday. On Monday, 5 days before they arrived, I drove to Margaret Hollis's office and I signed everything. The amended trust document ran to 31 pages. Margaret walked me through it section by section, the way a good attorney does, not assuming I would simply trust her work, but ensuring that I understood every clause and had the opportunity to object to or modify any provision before I committed to it. I did not object to any of it. I had read the draft she had sent me the previous week with the same attention I gave structural drawings, looking for gaps, ambiguities, anything that could fail under load. There were none. Margaret was thorough. The primary beneficiary of the Revocable Living Trust was now the Eleanor Hutchins Memorial Foundation, an entity I was establishing simultaneously, whose purpose was to fund grief counseling services and educational scholarships in Eleanor's name in our county. The successor trustee was Margaret herself, with Patricia as backup. Marcus was not named anywhere in the document. The revised will named the Eleanor Hutchins Memorial Foundation as the primary beneficiary of my estate, with specific bequests to Patricia, to Robert, and to 3 charitable organizations Eleanor had supported during her lifetime. Marcus was not named. The new healthcare proxy named Patricia as my primary agent. The new power of attorney named Robert as my primary agent, with Patricia as backup. Marcus was not named in either document. I signed each one in Margaret's presence, with her paralegal as witness. Margaret signed as notary. The paralegal dated and affixed her seal. When the last document was complete, Margaret stacked them neatly, aligned the edges the way careful people do with important paper, and set them aside. Then she set down her pen and looked at me across the desk. She said, "Gerald, are you certain?" I said, "I have been certain since the gas station." I became more certain with each thing David found. "I am completely certain now," she said. "I want to note, for the record, that you came to me of your own volition, that you have been thoughtful and deliberate throughout this process, and that at no point have you expressed any ambivalence about these decisions." I said, "That is accurate." She said, "I'm also going to note that Marcus could challenge this. He has standing as a natural heir. A challenge would be difficult. These documents are airtight. Your capacity is not in question, and we have a clear record of deliberation, but it's possible." I said, "Let him challenge it. If he does, the discovery process will be very educational for everyone involved." Margaret allowed herself a small, precise smile. She said, "That's one way to look at it." I drove home through the February morning. It was February now, the first week. The winter still hard and flat outside, and I felt, for the first time since Eleanor died, something that I can only describe as the restoration of order. Not happiness, not revenge, something quieter and more durable than either of those things. The sense that the structure was sound again, that I had identified the failure point and corrected it, and that the thing I had built across 31 years would stand. The third hunt cycle ran from Tuesday to Thursday. On Tuesday, I met with James Whitfield for the second time, and we filed the formal reports. The first was a report to Adult Protective Services, documenting the pattern of elder financial exploitation, the unauthorized account access, using my security credentials in March 2020, the forged insurance beneficiary change in April 2020, the mail forwarding order placed in March 2020, the transfer inquiry in January 2021, and the cognitive decline phone call to my retirement account custodian in November 2021. Whitfield had prepared a 30-page documentation package, organized chronologically, cross-referenced with account records, call logs, and postal service records, that laid out the pattern with complete clarity. The second report was a complaint to my state's financial regulatory authority regarding the unauthorized use of account credentials and the forged insurance document. This was a separate matter from the elder abuse report. It concerned the specific illegal acts rather than the overall pattern. Whitfield said, "Gerald, I want to be clear about something. Filing these reports does not guarantee any particular outcome. Investigations take time. Prosecutors have discretion. But it creates an official record that cannot be undone, and it puts Marcus and Lauren in a position where any subsequent action they take regarding your estate will be scrutinized." I said, "That's exactly what I want." He said, "There's one more thing. Once these reports are filed, Marcus and Lauren may be contacted by investigators. They will know that something has been reported. Do you want me to notify you the moment that happens so you can be prepared? I said, yes. And James, I want to be present at our house when they find out. I want to be there. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, when are they coming? I said, Saturday. He said, the reports will be filed today. I can't predict when investigators will make contact. It could be weeks, but the reports will be in the system. I said, that's enough. On Wednesday, David Chen called with the completed audit. The full picture was this. Across a period of 23 months, beginning in March of 2020 and ending in the month before the gas station, there had been 6 documented instances of unauthorized access to or inquiry about my financial accounts, the authorized user addition, the mail forwarding order, the insurance beneficiary change, the transfer inquiry, the cognitive decline phone call to the retirement account, and a 6th item David had found only in the final days of the audit, a request submitted to my homeowner's insurance company in September of 2021 asking that a second contact name be added to the policy for purposes of receiving notification of any coverage changes or claims. The second contact name was Lauren. 6 instances, 23 months. Every single one occurred while they were, to all outward appearances, the dutiful son and daughter-in-law who couldn't make it home for Christmas. I asked David to prepare a written summary of the audit findings, a clean, clear document, organized by date, with account names, amounts where relevant, and a description of each action. He said he would have it ready by Friday. I asked him one more question. David, in your professional judgment, does any of this constitute an attempt to steal from me? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Gerald, in my professional judgment, what you have described is a systematic effort to surveil your financial position, establish access to your accounts, and position the parties involved to take control of your assets, either through legal mechanisms, a competency challenge, a power of attorney, or by other means if those failed. Whether it constitutes theft in the legal sense is for the attorneys and investigators to determine. But in my professional judgment, yes, that is what this looks like. I said, thank you, David. I appreciate your directness. He said, Gerald, one more thing. I said, yes. He said, I've known you for 19 years. Eleanor too. I want you to know that what you're doing, the way you're doing it, she would be proud of you. I did not respond to that immediately. I sat with it for a moment, in the way you sit with something true, when you have been moving so fast and so deliberately that you have not had space to feel it. Then I said, I know. That's what keeps me steady. There was a brief silence. Then David said he would have the written summary ready by Friday, and we said goodbye, and I put the phone down, and I sat at my desk for a few minutes, without moving or planning or writing anything in the notebook, just sitting, just breathing. Thursday was quiet. I drove to the pharmacy. I made a grocery run. That evening I cooked a proper dinner for the first time in several weeks. A pot roast, Eleanor's recipe, the one she had made the first Friday night Lauren came to dinner 9 years earlier. The one she had written on a note card in her careful handwriting and handed across the table with a warm, genuine smile. The recipe had been sitting in Eleanor's recipe box all these years, between the index cards for her mother's bread and the one for the lemon cake she made every Easter. I made it from the card. The house smelled the way it used to smell on Friday evenings when she was alive. I ate alone at the dining room table, in my chair, with the chair across from me empty. I did not find this as difficult as I once had. I was getting used to it in the way that you get used to things when there is no alternative, and you are determined to keep living well. I thought about the weekend. Marcus and Lauren were driving up Saturday morning. They planned to arrive around noon. They intended to stay through Sunday. Marcus had texted me the details with the ease of a man who believed the visit was a normal family occasion, a check-in on the aging father, a reassurance that things were fine, perhaps a gentle continuation of the long campaign that had been running for years. What they did not know was that by the time they arrived, every document was signed and filed, every account was secured, every report was submitted, every piece of evidence had been documented, organized, and placed in the hands of professionals whose job it was to act on it. The inheritance they had been maneuvering toward for years had been redirected, quietly, legally, completely, to a foundation bearing Eleanor's name, in service of the grief counseling and education work she had cared about in her lifetime. The estate was no longer theirs to wait for. It had, in fact, never been theirs to wait for. They had misunderstood, from the beginning, the fundamental nature of what they were dealing with. They had looked at a 68-year-old man, alone in a house, and seen a diminishing asset. They had not understood, had never once considered, that the 68-year-old man had spent 31 years building things designed to last, and that he understood, better than almost anyone, how to identify the point of failure in a structure and correct it before it collapsed. They had planned for an old man becoming irrelevant. They had gotten Gerald Hutchins, civil engineer, operating at full capacity, with every document signed and filed, and witnesses named, and lawyers retained. On Friday morning, I received the written audit summary from David by email. I printed it. I placed it in the locked drawer, with the passport and the deed and the folded legal pad from the first morning. I locked the drawer. On Friday afternoon, Margaret called to confirm that all documents had been filed with the appropriate county offices and that certified copies were on their way to me by overnight mail. She said, "Gerald, it's done. All of it." I said, "Thank you, Margaret, for everything." She said, "Eleanor would have liked this." I said, "She would have. She really would have." I made tea. I sat in the kitchen. I looked at the empty chair across the table, Eleanor's chair, which I had not moved and would not move, and I said to her, in the quiet of the house on Ashford Drive that we had bought together in 1987, and that was mine, and would remain mine, and would go to the foundation she had earned with 37 years of her life. "Eleanor, it's done. They're coming tomorrow, and this time I'm ready." The morning after that, Marcus's SUV pulled into my driveway at 12:03. I watched them from the kitchen window. Marcus parked in the driveway with the particular precision of someone who has parked in that driveway hundreds of times and knows exactly how much space to leave between the front bumper and the garage door. He cut the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. I watched Lauren look at her phone, checking it, the way she always checked it, the way I now understood she had always been checking it. And then she put it in her bag, and they got out of the car. Marcus was carrying a bag from a bakery. A peace offering, I understood, something to place on the counter and gesture toward, to fill the first awkward minutes of arrival with the business of putting things in the refrigerator and asking where the plates were. Lauren was carrying nothing. She walked toward the front door with the easy, proprietary confidence of a woman who had decided, some time ago, that this house was already in some essential way hers. I opened the door before they could knock. I said, "Marcus, good to see you. Come in." I hugged my son. I shook Lauren's hand. I was warm. I was unhurried. I was, to all outward appearances, the aging father they had come to manage. A little quieter than usual, perhaps. A little settled. But fundamentally, the same man who had said that would be lovely on the phone 2 weeks ago, and who had shown no sign since of anything except the ordinary, slightly isolated existence of a widower in his late 60s. I had set the kitchen table with coffee and the cups Eleanor used for company. I had put out a plate of the shortbread cookies Patricia had brought me the week before. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. A man who had made an effort. Who was glad to have visitors. Who was perhaps a little lonely and not too proud to show it. Marcus set the bakery bag on the counter. He said, "We brought some things from that place downtown you like." I said, "That's very kind. Thank you." Lauren sat down at the kitchen table. She looked around the kitchen with the particular quality of attention I had been watching for years. Not obviously appraising, not rude, but aware. Cataloging. The way someone looks at a space they are calculating. We drank coffee. We talked about the drive. There had been some construction on the highway, Marcus said. Added 20 minutes. Lauren mentioned a restaurant they had tried recently. Described the menu in some detail. Marcus asked about the neighbors, about the Hendersons next door who had a new baby. I answered every question with the warmth and ease of a man who had nothing on his mind except being pleased to see his son. I refilled cups. I passed the shortbread. I asked about Lauren's work, about a project Marcus had mentioned in an earlier text. Lauren was in her element in these first 40 minutes. She was relaxed, comfortable, working the room the way she always worked rooms. Warmth modulated precisely, attention distributed strategically, building toward something without appearing to build toward anything. I watched her do it with a clarity I had never had before. 9 years of watching the same performance, and only now, with everything documented and filed and signed, could I see the machinery clearly. It was, I will say, one of the finer performances of my life. After about 40 minutes, Lauren said, in the particular tone she used when she had decided to address something she had been building toward for some time, "Gerald, Marcus and I have been talking, and we wanted to have a conversation with you today about some things we've been thinking about." I said, "Of course. What's on your mind?" She said, "We've been thinking about the future, about your situation here. This house is wonderful, but we worry about you being so far from us, being alone, and we wanted to talk about some options." Marcus nodded. He was doing the thing he always did in these conversations, aligning himself with Lauren's framing, adding his presence as confirmation, but leaving her to carry the words. I said, "What kind of options?" Lauren said, "We've been doing some research into some different living arrangements, communities that would give you more support, more social connection. And we also wanted to talk about the estate plan. We think it might be time to review things, to make sure everything is set up in a way that makes sense going forward. Marcus is your only family, and we want to make sure you're protected." Protected. That was the word she chose. I noted it with the same precision I had been applying to everything for 6 weeks. I said, "That's very thoughtful of you, Lauren. I appreciate you both thinking about these things." She said, "We could help manage things. If you wanted to simplify, make decisions now while everything is clear, rather than waiting until, well, you know, until I was no longer capable." That was the sentence she didn't finish, the sentence she had been building toward for years. I said, "Can I ask, what specifically were you thinking about in terms of the estate plan?" Lauren exchanged the briefest of glances with Marcus. Less than a second. But I caught it. I had been watching for it. She said, "We thought it might make sense to review the beneficiary designations. Make sure Marcus is properly positioned. And honestly, Gerald, it might simplify things considerably if we were more involved in the day-to-day management of your accounts, just to keep an eye on things, make sure nothing falls through the cracks." I looked at her for a moment. Then at Marcus. Marcus said, "Dad, we just want to help." He meant it. That was the thing about Marcus that had always made this situation more complicated than it would have been if he had simply been a calculating person. He was not entirely a calculating person. He was a weak person who had been led, over years, by a calculating one, and who had arrived at this kitchen table genuinely believing that what Lauren had framed as help was, in fact, help. He looked at me with something close to sincerity. He believed he was here for my benefit. I thought about the boy I had held in a delivery room for 11 minutes in 1988, the training wheels coming off in 1994, the white-knuckled handlebars, the laughing, 6 hours in a hospital waiting room when he was 12, $340,000 given freely, without keeping score, because that was what fathers did. I felt grief for him in that moment. Real grief. separate from the anger and exhaustion of the past 6 weeks. The grief of a father who had wanted something different for his son and was finally, completely, accepting that he was not going to get it. I said, "Marcus, Lauren, I want to talk to you about something." I stood up. I walked to my desk in the corner of the kitchen, the desk where I paid bills, where I had kept the engineering notebook, where the locked drawer held the passport and the deed, and I unlocked the bottom drawer. I removed a manila folder. I brought it back to the table and I set it down. I said, "I spent the last 6 weeks reviewing my financial accounts and estate planning documents. I want to share some of what I found with you." Lauren's expression did not change. That in itself was information. A person who had nothing to fear would have looked puzzled or curious. Lauren looked composed, carefully, deliberately composed. I said, "In March of 2020, 5 weeks after Eleanor's funeral, someone used my security credentials to add an authorized user to my brokerage trust account. The authorized user was you, Lauren." Silence. I said, "In April of 2020, a change request was submitted to my life insurance company, adding you as a secondary contingent beneficiary. The request was submitted by mail during a period when all correspondence from the insurance company was being forwarded to a P.O. box registered to your address." Marcus said, "Dad." I said, "I'm not finished." I opened the folder. I placed the first document on the table, a copy of the brokerage account service history. I placed the second document beside it, a copy of the Postal Service forwarding record. I placed the third beside that, a copy of the insurance company's record of the beneficiary change request, with the submission date and the forwarding address highlighted. I said, "In January of 2021, a call was made to my brokerage, inquiring about the process for transferring trust assets. The call came from the authorized user account. In November of 2021, a call was made to my retirement account custodian, suggesting that I was showing signs of cognitive decline and asking about establishing a power of attorney over the account." Lauren set down her coffee cup. Very carefully, very slowly. I said, "In September of 2021, a request was submitted to my homeowner's insurance, adding your name as a secondary contact for policy notifications." I said, 6 instances, 23 months. The kitchen was completely silent. Through the window I could see the backyard, the bare January trees, the gray flat sky. The shortbread cookies were still on the plate, untouched. Marcus said, in a voice I had not heard from him since he was a boy, "Dad, I didn't know about all of..." Lauren said nothing. I looked at Marcus. I said, "Marcus, I believe that some of what happened you were aware of, and some of it you were not. I think you are not the person who designed this. I think you are the person who went along with it." He looked at the table. I said, "That is not a better position to be in. It is a different one." I turned to Lauren. She met my eyes. For the first time in 9 years of knowing her, Lauren was not composed. She was not charming. She was not smoothly redirecting toward a warmer topic or deploying the particular skill she had, the ability to absorb a difficult moment and reframe it before anyone noticed the gap. She was sitting across the kitchen table from a 68-year-old man she had spent 2 years trying to systematically outmaneuver, and she was understanding, in real time, that she had failed, completely. Every calculation she had made, the authorized user, the mail forwarding, the forged signatures, the cognitive decline inquiry, the downsizing campaign, the dinner that ended at a gas station in January, every careful, patient, incremental step in a plan that had been running for nearly 2 years, had produced not the outcome she had designed, but this kitchen table, this folder, these documents, laid out in order, with dates and amounts and account names, by a man she had categorized as a diminishing variable, and who had, in the 11 weeks since she had watched him get out of a car in 22-degree weather, without looking up from her phone, entirely reclassified himself. I let the silence sit for a moment. I had earned this moment. I did not rush it. I said, I have filed reports with Adult Protective Services and with the State Financial Regulatory Authority. My estate planning documents have been fully revised. Every beneficiary designation that named Marcus has been changed. The trust has been amended. The will has been rewritten. A new healthcare proxy and power of attorney have been executed, naming my sister Patricia and my friend Robert respectively. You are named in none of them. Lauren said, Gerald, you don't understand what you're... I said, I understand exactly what I'm doing, Lauren. I have understood exactly what I was doing since the night Marcus left me at a gas station in January. She stopped. I said, I want you to hear me clearly, because I am going to say this once and I will not repeat it. What you did, the unauthorized account access, the forged documents, the mail forwarding, the phone calls to my financial custodians, constitutes elder financial exploitation under the laws of this state. I have retained an attorney who specializes in this area. The reports I have filed are in the system. What happens next is not entirely in my hands, but I want you to understand that it is completely out of yours. Marcus said, Dad, please. I said, Marcus, I love you. I have always loved you. But love does not require me to pretend that what happened in this house, and what has been happening for the past 2 years, is acceptable. It is not acceptable, and the appropriate consequence of it is exactly what I have described. Lauren stood up. She picked up her bag, she said, and her voice was very controlled, very careful, in the way of someone managing a situation that has gone entirely wrong. We should go. Marcus did not move for a moment. He was looking at the documents on the kitchen table. Then he looked at me. I have thought a great deal about what I saw in his face in that moment. I think it was grief. Not grief about the inheritance. I do not think Marcus, at his core, was someone who wanted money more than he wanted his father's regard. I think it was the grief of a person who has finally understood, in one undeniable moment, the distance between the person they allowed themselves to become and the person they could have been. I hope I am right about that. I still hope that. Lauren touched his arm. He stood up. He took his jacket from the back of the chair. He said, at the door, Dad, He did not finish the sentence. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he walked to his car. I stood on the front porch and watched Marcus's SUV back out of the driveway, for what I understood, without drama or bitterness, was likely the last time. The turn signal clicked on at the end of the street. They turned left. They were gone. I went inside. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment, in the house on Ashford Drive that Eleanor and I had bought together in 1987, and that was mine, and would remain mine. Then I went to the kitchen and I finished my coffee. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. The investigation moved faster than James Whitfield had predicted. Adult Protective Services made initial contact with Marcus and Lauren within 3 weeks of the reports being filed. Marcus called me the day after the investigator reached him, not to apologize, not to explain, but in the panicked way of someone who has discovered that what they thought was safely in the past has been filed, documented, and placed in the hands of people whose profession is to act on it. He said, Dad, someone from APS called me today. What did you do? I said, Marcus, I filed the reports I told you I was filing when you were sitting at my kitchen table. None of this should surprise you. You need to speak with an attorney. That is the only advice I can give you right now. I hung up. Lauren did not call. She has not called since the Saturday she stood up from my kitchen table and said we should go. The State Financial Regulatory Authority completed its review 6 weeks later and forwarded the findings to the county prosecutor's office. James Whitfield relayed this in his careful way, noting that referral did not guarantee charges and that I should expect the full resolution to take considerably longer than the investigation itself. I said, the purpose of what I did was not to put Marcus in prison. The purpose was to protect what Eleanor and I built, document what had been done, and ensure it could never happen again. Whatever the prosecutor decides is the prosecutor's decision. I have done what I needed to do, he said. That's a healthy way to look at it, Gerald. What I want to tell you about is what happened in the months after. The quieter things, the ones that constitute the actual shape of a life reclaimed. Patricia came for dinner the second Sunday after the confrontation. She brought wine and sat in Eleanor's chair at the kitchen table. Not the reading chair in the living room, that one stays empty, but Eleanor's chair at the table. And we talked for 4 hours. About Marcus as a child, about Eleanor, about the years of grief and caregiving when I had not noticed what was growing in the dark around the edges of my life. Patricia did not say "I told you so," though she had every right to. She said, "Jerry, you saw it when you needed to see it. That's enough." I told her about the Eleanor Hutchins Memorial Foundation. Her eyes went bright in the way they do when something genuinely moves her. Not the polished brightness of someone performing emotion, but the real kind that arrives without warning, and that you try, in older age, not to be embarrassed about. She said, "Eleanor would have loved that." I said, "I know. That's why I did it." The foundation was formally established in the 3rd month after the confrontation. I worked with Margaret to structure it correctly, a 501(c)(3 charitable organization with a board of 3, myself, Patricia, and a grief counselor from the hospice organization that had supported Eleanor and me during her final months. The foundation's initial endowment came from the brokerage trust account, $440,000, redirected from the account Lauren had added herself to as an authorized user 2 years earlier, and from the cash value of my life insurance policy, $97,000, surrendered and contributed directly. Combined, $537,000. 8 months after its establishment, the Eleanor Hutchins Memorial Foundation distributed its first round of grief counseling grants, supporting 23 individuals and families who needed professional grief support and could not afford it. Eleanor had believed that no one should have to process the worst loss of their life without help simply because they could not pay for it. The foundation was her belief made operational. I attended the first grant distribution ceremony in the county library community room on a Tuesday afternoon in October. 23 recipients, their families, Margaret and Patricia, the hospice grief counselor from the board, a small number of people from the local paper. I did not give a long speech. Eleanor would have found a long speech embarrassing on everyone's behalf. I said, "My wife believed that grief was not something to be endured alone. This foundation exists because she was right, and because the resources to act on it existed, and because the people who tried to prevent those resources from being used this way did not succeed. I am grateful beyond words that they did not." Then I sat down and let the afternoon proceed without me at the center of it. Robert was there. He sat beside me during the ceremony, and afterward, we walked out into the October afternoon and stood on the library steps, and he said, "Jerry, she would have been here, you know. She would have been in the thick of it, running the whole thing." I said, "I know. She was better at this than I am." He said, "You're not bad at it." I said, "I'm learning." We stood there a few more minutes. The October light was the color of the curtains in our bedroom, the ones Eleanor picked in 1994, because she said they reminded her of the inside of a seashell. I thought about how specific grief is. How it arrives not in waves but in precise sensory connections. Afternoon light matching bedroom curtains. And suddenly, you are not on library steps in October, but in a room 30 years ago, watching a woman hold a fabric swatch to the window and say, "In the certain way she said certain things." "Yes, this one." I said, "Robert, I'm all right." He said, "I know you are." We went to dinner afterward. The 3 of us. A restaurant downtown Eleanor had liked. Good food, sensible noise level. We had a bottle of wine. Patricia made us laugh twice, with the particular dryness she and Eleanor had shared. The family humor that runs through generations, whether you cultivate it or not. It was a very good evening. Now let me tell you, clinically and without embellishment, what happened to Marcus and Lauren. The county prosecutor filed charges in the 8th month. Marcus: 1 count of unauthorized access to financial accounts. 1 count of elder financial exploitation. Lauren: 3 counts of unauthorized access. 2 counts of elder financial exploitation. 1 count of fraud for the forged insurance change. And 1 count of mail fraud for the postal forwarding order. Their cases moved on separate tracks with separate attorneys. Their interests fully diverged. Marcus accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of elder financial exploitation, a felony, and received 3 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and a 10-year prohibition from serving as executor, trustee, or power of attorney agent for any estate. He lost his position at his firm, which had a morality clause his plea triggered. He and Lauren separated 6 months after charges were filed. He is living, as of the last information I have, in a 2-bedroom apartment, working a position that pays considerably less than before. I have spoken to him twice since the kitchen table. Once when he called after the plea was finalized to say he was sorry. I listened. I said I hoped he would use the time ahead to become the person I always believed he could be. He said he would try. I believed he meant it. Whether meaning it is enough is his to determine. Lauren did not accept a plea agreement. She contested the charges. Her trial is ongoing as of the time I am recording this, and I will not speak to the specifics of what may or may not be established in that proceeding. What I will say is that the documentation James Whitfield and David Chen produced, the call logs, the account service histories, the postal records, the forged insurance form, is thorough, complete, organized with the precision of a man who spent 31 years building things that needed to stand up under scrutiny. She is no longer living in the house she and Marcus shared. She moved out when their separation was finalized. I do not know where she is. I do not need to know. The house on Ashcroft Drive is mine. Free, clear, exactly as it has always been. I jogged 3 miles this morning. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper. The chair across from me was empty, as it has been for nearly 2 years, and I did not find it as devastating as I once did, which is not the same as not finding it painful, but which is its own kind of progress. I have dinner with Patricia on Thursday. Robert and I are planning a trip in the spring, somewhere warm, somewhere Eleanor would have found interesting and read 3 books about before we left. The foundation is accepting applications for its 2nd round of grants. I am, at 68 years old, a man whose affairs are in order, whose house is his own, whose wife's name is on something that will outlast all of us, whose mornings are his. That is everything I was trying to protect. I want to tell you something about silence before I finish this story. Not the silence of defeat. I have had that too, and I know its texture. It is heavy and directionless. The silence of someone who has absorbed a blow and does not know yet whether they will stand back up. That is not what I am talking about. I am talking about the silence of a person who has decided. The 37 seconds I stood on that gas station sidewalk in January were the most productive 37 seconds of the past 2 years. Not because I accomplished anything in them. I was simply standing in the cold watching taillights disappear. But because I did not fill them with noise. I did not react. I did not call out, did not argue, did not perform the grief or the outrage that the situation might have entitled me to perform. I stood still. I let the information settle through me completely, and in that settling I found the thing I needed, not anger, not strategy, not even clarity yet, just the willingness to proceed without announcing myself. That willingness was the beginning of everything that followed. I am 68 years old. I have buried my father and my mother and my wife. I have built things with my hands and with my mind, and with the unglamorous daily discipline of showing up, year after year, doing the work requires. I have made mistakes, some small, some significant. I did not see Lauren clearly for years, and I paid for that in ways that are hard to quantify, but were real. I do not pretend otherwise. But I will tell you this. When the moment came, when the sidewalk was cold and the taillights were gone, and it was just me and the January dark and 37 seconds of choice, I made the right one. And making the right choice at the right moment, after a lifetime of building the character and the knowledge and the patience that make the right choice possible, is what I want you to take from this story, if you take anything. Because here is what I know about the people who try to diminish you. They are counting on your silence being the silence of defeat. They are counting on your restraint being the restraint of someone who does not know what to do. They are counting on your grief making you slow, your love making you blind. Your fundamental decency, the decency that does not keep score, that gives without calculating, that extends good faith long past the point where a colder person would have withdrawn it, making you vulnerable in ways that a person without that decency would not be vulnerable. They are not wrong that those things make you vulnerable. They are wrong about what they can do with that vulnerability. Because they do not understand, cannot understand, because it requires a kind of patience they have never needed to develop, that the silence of a person who has decided is indistinguishable from the silence of a person who has given up, right up until the moment it isn't. And by the time it isn't, it is too late. Lauren spent 2 years building infrastructure to access a $2.3 million estate. She was patient. She was methodical. She had learned to read the vulnerability of grief, had watched me lose Eleanor, and seen in that loss a window that a person with different values would not have been able to see at all. What she had not accounted for was that I was also patient, also methodical, also capable of the long game, and that 31 years of building that estate had given me exactly the expertise I needed to defend it. I knew what a revocable trust was and how to change it. I knew what a power of attorney was and how to revoke it. I knew the difference between an authorized user and a trustee. I knew how to read account service histories, pull postal records, and give attorneys instructions. She had looked at a 68-year-old man and seen something diminishing. She had gotten a civil engineer. A civil engineer who had spent 31 years building things designed to last, and who understood, in his bones, the difference between a structure that is sound and one that merely appears to be, and who had, finally, identified the hidden flaw in the structure of his own life, and corrected it with the same methodical attention he had brought to every bridge, every road, every foundation he had ever designed. The Eleanor Hutchins Memorial Foundation is open. It carries the name of the woman who saw Lauren clearly 3 years before I did, who said something is not right with that girl Jerry, and who was right, as she almost always was, about the things that mattered. The foundation carries her belief that no one should grieve alone. It carries her conviction that the resources you spend a lifetime building ought to serve something larger than the people who are simply waiting for you to stop using them. That is Eleanor's legacy, built from what they tried to take, pointing in the direction she would have pointed. I think about her often, not with the raw, disorienting grief of the first year. That has changed, as grief does when you let it, into something quieter, and more permanent, and more sustaining. I think about her the way you think about the people who shaped you, with gratitude, with recognition, with the steady awareness that everything you know about how to be a person of integrity, you learned, at least in part, by watching her do it first. I think about the note card with the pot roast recipe, handed across the table with a warmth that was genuine even when the person receiving it had not earned it. I think about the kitchen table conversations, the ones that needed the house to be quiet first, and the quality of attention she brought to them, as if the thing being said was the only thing in the world that mattered while she was hearing it. She was, in all the ways that count, a better person than I am. I have known this for 43 years, and I have been grateful for it for all of them. She would have handled all of this differently. She was better with people than I am, better at the warmth that makes difficult conversations possible, better at the particular kind of honesty that lands gently even when its content is hard. She would not have needed to wait 6 weeks and sign 31 pages of amended trust documents. She would have looked at Lauren across the kitchen table 10 years ago and said, in her direct, unembellished way, the thing that needed to be said, and Lauren would have understood that she had been seen. The whole architecture of the past 2 years might never have been built. But Eleanor is gone, and I am the one who is here, who had to handle it the way I could handle it, slowly, quietly, with a great deal of documentation. It worked, because I did not react, because I assessed before I built, because every skill I had developed in 31 years of engineering, reading a structure, identifying failure points, designing the correction, implementing it with precision, applied with perfect fidelity to this situation. Some things you build with steel and concrete. Some things you build with documents and patience, and the willingness to sit in a plastic chair at 11 at night, drinking terrible coffee, and thinking carefully about what comes next. Both kinds of building require the same things. A clear understanding of what you are working with, a plan that accounts for real loads, and the discipline to execute without cutting corners, without rushing, and without letting anyone see the blueprints before the building is complete. Marcus and Lauren thought they were reading a diminishing man. They were reading blueprints. I want to leave you with the thing that has stayed with me most from these past 11 weeks. Not the legal resolution, not the documents, not even the foundation, as much as all of those things matter to me. The thing that stays is what I said to Eleanor in the gas station, in the quiet of my own head, while I was waiting for the taxi. I said, "Eleanor, I think I finally see it, and I am going to handle it, carefully, quietly, completely." She would have said, "Of course you are. You always do eventually, Jerry. You just take a while to get there." She would have been right. She was almost always right. If you are watching this, and you are in the middle of a situation where someone you love has decided that your love for them is a resource rather than a relationship, I want to say this directly, one time, without embellishment. You are not obligated to continue. Love does not require you to fund the people who are systematically dismantling what you built with it. Loyalty is not the same as compliance. Family is not the same as blood. My father believed that the measure of a man was what he left behind when he was gone. Not what he accumulated while he lived, but what he passed forward. My father was right. But what you pass forward does not have to go to the people who were simply in line to receive it, by accident of birth. It can go to something that earns it, something that deserves it, something that carries the name and the belief and the work of the person you loved most into the future. That is what I chose. That is what I am at peace with. The Eleanor Hutchins Memorial Foundation is open for applications. If you are in our county and you are grieving and you cannot afford professional support, I want you to know that help exists, and it is because of a woman who believed you deserved it. Her name was Eleanor. She was, without question, the best person I have ever known. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in it named an experience you have been carrying alone, I want you to drop that in the comments. Not because I need the validation, but because the comment sections of videos like this one are where people who have been through something similar find each other, and that finding matters. Hit the like button if this resonated. Subscribe if you want to be here for whatever I share next. And share this if you know someone who needs to hear it. Someone who is still extending good faith past the point where the evidence supports it. Someone who is sitting in a cold parking lot, metaphorically or literally, trying to decide whether to react or to proceed. Someone who needs to be reminded that silence is not always surrender, that sometimes silence is a blueprint. I am Gerald Hutchins. I am 68 years old. I built a life that was worth protecting, and when the time came, I protected it. And every morning when I sit at my kitchen table with my coffee and my newspaper, And the chair across from me empty. I know, with a certainty that is quiet and complete, and requires no more defending, that I did right by her. They thought my silence was weakness. They forgot that a silent man with a legal pad and 31 years of knowing how to build things that last is not a man who has given up. He is a man who is already finished. That is enough. That is more than enough. It is, in fact, everything.